Story 1. Midnight Station of the Ghosts. It was a cold New Year's Eve, and Sarah Thompson found herself standing on a nearly empty train platform at 11:30 p.m. The dimly lit station was quiet save for the occasional whistle of the wind that seemed to chill her very bones. She had been looking forward to her trip back home for the holidays for weeks, but now after several delays, the train she was supposed to catch had been canceled. Of course, Sarah muttered under her breath, pulling her coat tighter around her. She glanced around at the station, a lonely relic from another time. It was old, probably over 100 years old, with wooden benches and rusted signs. It was a place Sarah had never heard of before, a tiny town just far enough off the beaten path to be forgotten by most. She was the only one left waiting now. Her phone showed that all trains were canceled until further notice, and there didn't seem to be anyone around to ask about alternative transportation. The platform was deserted, and as the clock ticked closer to midnight, Sarah began to feel the eerie stillness of the place. The only sounds now were the gusts of wind and the faint rattle of a broken sign swaying above her. Her phone battery was running low, and her fingers, numb from the cold, fumbled with the device. She sighed and shoved it back in her pocket. There was no way she was going to spend the night here, she thought. She had to find another way to get home, no matter what. She turned to head to the station's small waiting room to get out of the cold, but as she started walking, something caught her eye. At the far end of the platform, the shadow of a figure was moving. It wasn't a person, at least not like anyone she had ever seen. The figure was tall, thin, and had an unnatural, almost ghostly quality to it. Sarah froze in her tracks, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure seemed to glide rather than walk, its movements fluid and eerily quiet. "Hello?" Sarah called out, her voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it just continued to move along the platform in a slow, deliberate manner. Sarah took a step forward, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Was it a prank, someone playing a joke on her? It was too cold for anyone to be out there just walking around. But then again, the more she thought about it, the more she realized that something about the situation felt wrong. She hesitated, torn between curiosity and fear. Should she approach? But what if it was a trap, or worse, something more sinister? The figure was almost at the end of the platform now, and Sarah's feet moved instinctively, her legs carrying her toward it. As she took another step, the figure suddenly turned, its face hidden beneath a dark hood. The wind seemed to pick up, swirling around her, as the figure's presence grew more intense. A chill ran down Sarah's spine, and she stopped in her tracks. The figure didn't speak, didn't make a sound. Instead, it raised one long, thin arm pointing toward the entrance of the station. Sarah blinked, trying to process what was happening. Was it warning her, or trying to direct her somewhere? There was a sensation in the air, something oppressive and thick, like the temperature had dropped even further. Before she could react, the figure turned and began to walk away, moving toward the entrance of the station with a steady, unnatural pace. Sarah watched it go, unable to look away. Her gut told her to run, to leave the station and head into the night, but something inside her, some strange instinct, urged her to follow. She slowly walked behind the figure, feeling like a puppet on invisible strings. The waiting room door creaked open as the figure disappeared inside. The air felt different now, heavy and stale. Sarah hesitated just before crossing the threshold, but her legs carried her inside anyway. The waiting room was old, dimly lit by a flickering bulb in the corner. The room smelled of mildew and dust, the old wooden benches covered in a thick layer of grime. But it wasn't the room that caught Sarah's attention, it was the figure. It was no longer standing at the far end of the room, but instead, it was now seated on one of the benches, as still as a statue. The figure's hooded face was turned toward her. For a moment, Sarah couldn't breathe. Her mind raced. but her body refused to move. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to run back outside, but something was keeping her there. Was this real? Was she imagining it? Are you real? Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it slowly raised its arm and pointed toward the far wall. Sarah's eyes followed the gesture, and that's when she saw a large, cracked mirror. The glass reflected nothing but darkness. No reflection of her. No reflection of the figure. Just darkness. Her breath caught in her throat as a cold, sudden realization dawned on her. The figure wasn't directing her to the mirror, it was warning her. The mirror seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, like something was trapped inside. Then, as if it had a life of its own, the mirror began to crack, tiny lines spreading across its surface. "Leave," a voice echoed in her mind. It was soft at first, like a whisper, but it grew louder, becoming more urgent. "Leave now." Sarah didn't know if it was her own thoughts or something from beyond, but the voice snapped her out of her paralysis. She turned to run, but as soon as her foot hit the ground, the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. Panic surged through her chest tightening as she sprinted to the door and tugged at the handle. It wouldn't budge. Her breaths were shallow and frantic as she turned around, eyes wide with terror. The figure had stood up again, its face now visible beneath the hood. But it wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its skin was pale, its eyes hollow and dark like pits of pure emptiness. The face was twisted in a grotesque mockery of a human being, its expression impossible to read. Sarah backed away, her heart pounding in her ears. She grabbed her phone, but there was no signal. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls moving inward, suffocating her. The figure slowly reached out its hand, and as it did, the shadows in the corners of the room began to stretch, elongating toward Sarah like tendrils of dark smoke. The temperature dropped even further, and she could see her breath fogging in the air. With one last burst of adrenaline, Sarah screamed, slamming her body against the door once more. This time, it gave way, swinging open with a loud creak. She didn't look back. She didn't care what was chasing her. She ran. Outside, the wind howled, and the train station was silent again. But Sarah didn't stop running until she was several blocks away, gasping for breath and terrified. She kept running through the dark, not looking back. It wasn't until she reached a small convenience store, where the lights were bright and the door was unlocked, that she finally stopped, trembling uncontrollably. She glanced around, still expecting to see the figure behind her, but it was gone. The clerk behind the counter gave her a confused look, but Sarah didn't explain. She just paid for a bottle of water and sat down, trying to steady her shaking hands. As she sat there, waiting for her heart to slow, she couldn't help but wonder, was it just a nightmare? Or had she really seen something that night, something far worse than any ghost? She didn't know for sure, but she was certain of one thing. She would never, ever return to that station again. Story 2. Frozen Memories. The snowflakes fell in thick, heavy clumps, each one unique in its crystalline beauty, yet contributing to the overwhelming, endless whiteness that blanketed the landscape. Nathaniel Carter, known to his friends as Nate, adjusted his woolen cap and glanced out the truck window as he navigated the narrow dirt road. The tires crunched loudly in the snow, and the engine hummed steadily, cutting through the biting cold of northwestern Ontario's winter. It was New Year's Eve, and Nate, along with his two best friends, Trevor and Jake, were making their annual pilgrimage to the remote, frozen lake where they would spend the night ice fishing, as they had done for years. The drive had been long, and the weather conditions were less than ideal, but Nate didn't mind. The cold, the wind, the snow, all of it seemed to add to the tradition, the ritual of it all. There was something uniquely calming about the solitude of a snowy night spent in the wilderness. No distractions, no noise, just the crackling of the fire and the quiet murmur of the ice beneath them. "It's gonna be a good one this year," Trevor said, breaking the silence. Trevor, the most rugged of the group, his thick beard dusted with frost, always had an optimistic outlook when it came to ice fishing. "I sure hope so," Nate muttered, glancing at Jake, who was hunched over in the back seat, checking his gear. "Last year's trip was a bust." "Yeah, but this time it'll be different," Jake replied, his voice muffled by the pile of jackets and fishing rods he was sorting through. "We've got the best spot. No one's been up here in months." That was true. The lake they were heading to wasn't a popular spot, not for casual fishermen anyway. It was secluded off the beaten path and barely known to anyone outside of their tight circle. The remoteness was one of the reasons they loved it. The other reason, of course, was that the fish were plentiful, but they didn't talk about that much. It was more about the tradition, the silence, the connection to something primal. But this year, as they neared the lake, something felt off. The air was heavier than usual, the snowstorm a little fiercer, the wind a little sharper. Nate couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't the weather, it was something else. He tried to push the thought aside as they arrived at the lake, the truck's headlights cutting through the swirling snow, illuminating the untouched ice ahead of them. "We're here," Trevor said with a smile, throwing the truck into park. "Let's get set up before this storm gets any worse." Nate climbed out of the truck, his boots crunching in the deep snow. Jake followed, and the two of them began unloading the gear from the back, setting up their ice fishing tent and equipment. It was a familiar routine, one they had performed countless times. But Nate's unease lingered, gnawing at him as the snow continued to fall in thick, heavy sheets. "There's something strange about tonight," he muttered to Trevor, who was setting up the pop-up shelter. "You mean besides the storm?" Trevor chuckled, not taking him seriously. "You're just getting paranoid, man. It's fine. You've been doing this for years. Let's fish, relax, and ring in the new year the right way." Nate didn't respond. He just kept glancing around, staring out into the dense snowflakes that seemed to swirl and move with an unnatural rhythm. It felt like something was watching them, but every time he turned his head, nothing was there. He was beginning to feel like the isolation was getting to him. But something about the way the wind howled across the frozen expanse made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. As night fell and they settled into the warmth of their shelter, the storm outside grew fiercer, the wind howling like a wild animal desperate to escape. The three friends sat around the small heater inside the tent, fishing rods set, hot drinks in hand, trying to make the most of the night. "All right, let's tell some stories," Jake said, breaking the silence. "I don't know about you guys, but I'm feeling a little too cozy. We need to keep ourselves awake." Trevor grinned. "Perfect. What kind of stories?" "Spooky ones," Jake replied. "It's New Year's Eve after all. Why not make it interesting?" The conversation quickly turned to ghost stories, and while Nate was usually all for it, something about the night made him hesitant. He kept looking out into the snowstorm, his gaze wandering back to the thick woods that bordered the lake. The wind was picking up again, and he could swear he heard something, a rustling, a scraping sound, something that didn't belong. But when he looked again, there was nothing. "I'm serious, guys," Nate said, his voice lower than usual. "I keep hearing weird noises out there. It's not just the wind." Trevor rolled his eyes. "You're being paranoid, dude. It's probably just an animal." Jake laughed. "Yeah, Nate, it's probably just a moose or something. Maybe a bear with a bad sense of humor." But Nate wasn't convinced. He knew the area well enough to know there were no bears this time of year, and moose weren't typically this far out. Whatever was out there was different. Suddenly, the wind seemed to shift. The tent's flaps shook violently, and the temperature inside dropped noticeably. Jake shivered. "Okay, Maybe there's something going on, he said, standing up to adjust the heater. Before he could make it to the heater, a loud bang came from outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy dragging across the ice. Nate's heart raced. The noise was close, much closer than before. Too close? What the hell was that? Trevor exclaimed, standing up from his seat and peering out into the dark storm. I don't know, but it's not a moose, Nate replied, his voice tight with fear. That's too heavy, too deliberate. There was a long moment of silence before the wind picked up again, howling through the trees, and another dragging sound echoed across the ice. This time, they all heard it, a slow, deliberate scraping, like something large was being pulled across the frozen surface. I'm not going out there, Jake said, backing away from the door. I'll go, Trevor said, reaching for the lantern. You guys stay inside. I'll see what it is. Nate's hand shot out, grabbing Trevor's arm. No, stay here. We don't know what's out there. But it was too late. Trevor was already heading for the door, lantern in hand. The storm howled louder as he stepped outside, vanishing into the swirling snow. The door of the tent closed behind him, and the remaining two friends sat in stunned silence. Minutes passed, but Trevor didn't return. Something's wrong, Nate said, his voice laced with panic. He should have been back by now. Jake's eyes were wide with fear, and he shook his head. You'll be fine. It's just a stupid prank. He'll come back laughing any second. But the minutes turned to an hour, and there was still no sign of Trevor. It felt like the air itself was thick with tension, as if the very storm outside had taken on a life of its own. Nate stood up, his legs trembling. I'm going out there. Are you crazy? Jake hissed. We can't just go out there in that storm. Trevor will come back, I'm sure of it. Nate ignored him and pulled on his jacket, grabbing a flashlight. He wasn't going to sit idly by. Trevor had been gone for far too long, and the dragging sound had only gotten louder. It was like something was out there, hunting them. He opened the door and stepped into the icy night. The wind whipped around him, and the snow fell in dense sheets, making it nearly impossible to see. But through the storm, Nate could just make out the shadow of Trevor's lantern flickering in the distance. Nate's heart pounded in his chest as he made his way toward it. But as he drew closer, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The lantern was lying on the ice, its flame still burning, but there was no sign of Trevor. Suddenly, the scraping sound returned, louder than ever, and this time it was behind him. Nate whipped around, but there was nothing there, only the snow and the deep, foreboding silence that followed. And then he heard it, a low, guttural growl. Something far too deep to be a human voice, something ancient. Nate turned, but the sound was gone. He felt a chill run down his spine, and instinctively, he bolted back toward the tent. When he returned, Jake was gone. In his place, a strange, blooded handprint stained the side of the tent. Nate's heart stopped. The storm howled louder, and the ice beneath his feet groaned in protest. It was too late. They weren't alone. Story 3: The Lost Wedding. It was a cold, dark New Year's Eve when Emma Reynolds, fresh off a year of endless planning and stress, found herself driving through the thick fog along a desolate stretch of highway. Her fiancé, Andrew, was beside her, trying to calm her nerves as the miles passed and the weather grew more treacherous. They were headed to the remotest state in the mountains, where they had planned their dream wedding for months. It was meant to be a private affair, with just their closest friends and family gathered to witness their vows. But as the hours passed, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "Emma, relax," Andrew said softly, glancing at her from the corner of his eye. He reached over and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "It's just a little fog. We'll be there in no time." I know, she replied, though her voice trembled. "But something feels wrong." This place? I don't know. It's too isolated. It's like we're not supposed to be here. Don't worry, Andrew reassured her. It's perfect. Just think about the wedding. Everything we've planned, the guests. We'll make this night unforgettable. Emma nodded, though her unease remained. She had never been one to believe in superstitions or odd feelings, but something about the remote location had always unsettled her. It wasn't just the isolation, it was the strange history surrounding the estate. Her mother had warned her against the place, claiming that the mansion was cursed. Of course, Emma had brushed it off as just another family tale, but her mother's warning echoed in the back of her mind. The fog continued to grow thicker, swallowing the road ahead of them, until the headlights barely cut through the whiteness. The road was narrow and winding, and Emma squinted to see through the mist. She could barely make out the outline of the trees on either side of the car, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. "We should be close, right?" she asked, trying to mask the anxiety in her voice. "I haven't seen any signs for a while." Andrew glanced at the GPS. "It says we're just a few miles away." "It's just that this damn fog is messing with the signal." They continued in silence, the only sound the hum of the car and the occasional crackle from the radio. The darkness around them seemed to deepen, and the fog grew heavier. Suddenly, Andrew slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as they came to a halt. "What's wrong?" Emma gasped, looking around in confusion. "I saw something in the road," Andrew said, his voice tight. He peered into the mist, but there was nothing there now, just a thick, impenetrable fog that made the night seem endless. Emma's heart raced. "What do you mean, something in the road?" "I don't know," Andrew said, his eyes darting back and forth nervously. "It was just a shadow, like a figure. But now..." He trailed off, unsure of how to explain what he had seen. Emma stared into the fog, trying to make out any shapes or movement, but there was nothing. Her breath quickened as a shiver ran down her spine. "We should turn back. Maybe we should find another place to stay tonight. This doesn't feel right." Andrew shook his head. "No, we've come this far. It's just a little fog. Let's keep going. We'll be there soon." Emma didn't say anything, but her unease deepened. The road felt endless, as though it stretched on forever through the fog. She glanced at Andrew, who was gripping the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. The silence between them grew heavy, and Emma's mind raced with thoughts of what could be waiting for them on this cursed road. As the minutes ticked by, Emma's eyes caught a glimpse of something up ahead. A faint light flickering in the distance. "Do you see that?" she whispered. Andrew looked up and squinted. "It's probably the estate," he said, his voice lacking conviction. "Let's just get there." Emma nodded, though her chest tightened. The light seemed to flicker unnaturally, casting an eerie glow against the fog. It was too distant to make out any details, but it looked like the glow of an old lantern, soft and ghostly, like something out of a dream. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just the weather playing tricks on her, but her instincts told her something was wrong. The car continued on, and soon they reached the gate of the estate. The once grand entrance, with its crumbling stone walls and rusted iron gate, was barely visible through the fog. The large, sprawling mansion loomed behind the gate, its dark silhouette rising from the ground like an ancient, forgotten monument. Andrew stopped the car at the gate, putting it in park. "Here we are," he said, though his voice was quieter than usual. Emma opened her door and stepped out, the cold air hitting her like a slap. She felt a chill in her bones as she gazed up at the mansion. The windows were dark, and there was a heaviness in the air that made it feel as though the building was watching them. She could almost hear the whispers of something from within, urging her to leave. "Andrew, I don't know," she started, but before she could finish, Andrew was already heading for the gate, pulling it open with a creak. "We're here," he said, his tone resolute. "It's just nerves. Let's go inside." Against her better judgment, Emma followed him. The gate swung open with an eerie groan, and they stepped through it, walking up the long, uneven path toward the mansion's front door. The fog seemed to grow thicker with every step, and Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As they reached the front door, Emma hesitated. It was an old wooden door, adorned with intricate carvings of leaves and vines, but the wood was weathered and cracked. There was something unnatural about the silence that surrounded them. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of their own footsteps echoing in the fog. Andrew knocked on the door, and there was a long pause before a faint voice answered from inside. "Who's there?" It was a woman's voice, soft and almost distant. "It's Andrew and Emma," he said, his voice a little too loud. "We're here for the wedding." The door creaked open, revealing a woman in a long black dress standing in the doorway. Her face was pale, her hair dark and wild, and her eyes were vacant, like she wasn't fully present. "Welcome," the woman said, stepping aside to let them in. "Please, come in, the others are waiting." Emma felt a shiver run down her spine as she stepped into the dimly lit hallway. The air was thick, and the house seemed to hum with a strange energy. The walls were lined with old portraits, their faces faded and worn, staring at her with cold, lifeless eyes. The house smelled of old wood and decay, and Emma couldn't help but feel as though they were intruding on something ancient. The woman led them down the hallway and into a large room at the back of the house. It was decorated in the style of an old Victorian ballroom, with chandeliers hanging from the ceiling and long velvet curtains draped across the windows. But there was no one there, no guests, no family, no wedding party. "Where is everyone?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. The woman turned to her, her vacant eyes staring deep into Emma's soul. "They are waiting for you," she said softly. "The ceremony is about to begin." Before Emma could ask any more questions, the doors to the ballroom slammed shut behind her. She turned to Andrew, but he was gone. She was alone. The room grew colder, the shadows stretching across the floor, and Emma felt a deep sense of dread settle in her chest. She spun around, searching for a way out, but the room was locked tight. There was no escape. Suddenly, the chandeliers flickered, and the music began. A soft, eerie waltz filled the room, and Emma saw a figure in the far corner, standing at the altar. It was Andrew, or someone who looked like him. He was dressed in a black suit, his back to her, as though waiting for her to join him. "Andrew," Emma cried, her voice echoing through the room. "What's going on? Where is everyone?" The figure at the altar slowly turned, revealing a twisted, contorted version of Andrew's face. His eyes were hollow, his smile grotesque, and his voice, when it came, was not his own. "This is not your wedding, Emma," the figure hissed. "This is the wedding that was lost long ago, and now you're part of it." Emma stumbled backward, terror flooding her veins. The room began to spin, the walls closing in on her, and the figure of Andrew stepped forward, his grin widening. "No," Emma screamed, trying to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She was frozen, trapped in a nightmare of her own making. As the figure approached, the music grew louder, the room darker, and Emma knew deep in her heart that she had walked into something far older than she could comprehend. Something that had been waiting for her. This was no wedding, it was a ritual, a curse, and Emma was its next victim.